Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the virtual press conference for the 2020 Congressional Pig Book. Unfortunately, this year, we have no live pigs, but we do have live members of Congress who will speak following my remarks. I want to thank them all for joining us. We have another half dozen senators and representatives who have recorded remarks that we will play once we are done. I'm Tom Schatz, president of Citizens Against Government Waste. This is the 28th edition of the Congressional Pig Book, and it follows just 2 days after the Congressional Budget Office reported a June budget deficit of $864 billion. The highest previous monthly record was $234 billion. And the $864 billion would be the sixth largest annual deficit. We know it's going to be higher at the end of this year and for several years thereafter. And while it's understandable that during this unprecedented healthcare and economic crisis, Congress has decided to spend all this money, it's also a great opportunity for Congress to undertake serious efforts to reduce wasteful spending. And that effort should start with the elimination of earmarks. For the third year in a row since the supposed earmark moratorium, members of Congress have set a record for the amount of spending on earmarks according to Citizens Against Government Waste 7-point criteria, which we developed back in 1991 with the bipartisan Congressional Pork Busters Coalition. The amount spent was $15.9 billion, a 3.9% increase over the $15.3 billion in fiscal year 2019. The number of earmarks dropped a little bit from 282 to 274, a decrease of 2.8%. Since fiscal year 1991, CAGW has identified 111,417 earmarks, costing taxpayers $375.7 billion. So yes, those little projects do add up over time. And the increase in pork barrel spending occurred behind closed doors without taxpayers knowing what was going on. There were no names of legislators attached to each earmark and few details. We do know, for example, in the Agriculture Appropriations Act, there's $9 million for the Appalachian Regional Authority and the Delta Regional Authority, so Appalachian Regional Commission and Delta Regional Authority, and another $27.5 million in the Energy and Water Appropriations Bill earmarked for the Delta Regional Authority. Both President Obama and President Trump have suggested that the Delta Regional Authority budget be cut, and these regional commissions duplicate many other federal, state, and local programs. Earmarks for the Department of Defense have always accounted for about half of the earmarks in the Pig Book. This year is no exception. The $7.5 billion in defense accounts for 47.2% of the earmarks. And the biggest one is the $2.1 billion added for 22 additional Joint Strike Fighter aircraft that the Pentagon did not request. And that's 6 more than in fiscal year 2019. It is well known that this aircraft is well over budget, almost twice the initial expense. The program's $428 billion, 19 years in development, 9 years behind schedule, and the lifetime operations and maintenance cost will be $1.2 trillion, making it the most expensive weapon system in history. And the 2020 Pig Book includes a slew of absurd nature-related earmarks. For the third year in a row, $65 million to recover Pacific salmon. A record in the following categories: $25.8 million to manage wild horses, $24 million to control aquatic plants, and $11.4 million to purchase fish screens, along with $663,000 to eliminate the brown tree snake in Guam. Now, perhaps the most flagrant earmark is the $16.7 million for the East-West Center in Hawaii, courtesy of Senator Brian Schatz, no relation. The senator has added this for 3 years in a row. It's a record amount. It's essentially the center's entire budget. Now, the East-West Center's geographical counterpart, the North-South Center, stopped receiving federal funding in 2001. There is no reason for the East-West Center to be getting a penny of taxpayer money. The taxpayers and legislators need to understand why the 2011 earmark moratorium was needed in the first place. There was a decade of scandals, the bridge to nowhere, lobbyists and members of Congress went to jail. And many members of Congress have been elected since then and do not remember what the true consequences of earmarks are. In fact, as the late Senator John McCain said, the problem with the arguments by proponents of earmarks is the more powerful you are, the more likely you are to get the earmark in. Therefore, it is a corrupt system. And the late Senator Tom Coburn said that earmarks are the gateway drug to Washington's spending addiction. Pork barrel earmarks still hold the power to corrupt Congress, waste taxpayer money, and erode trust in government. The best way to get rid of these earmarks and protect taxpayers is to enact a statutory permanent ban, going beyond what the Senate did by changing their rules to agree to a permanent ban in 2019. I am pleased to be joined today by distinguished members of Congress and senators who share CAGW's concern over the corruption, cost, and unfairness associated with earmarks. We will hear first from Senator Marcia Blackburn of Tennessee, followed by Representatives Ted Budd of North Carolina, Tim Burchett of Tennessee, Bill Flores of Texas, who I would like to point out has set the record for the most consistent and consecutive attendance at the Pig Book. So we will miss you when you're gone. Somebody's going to have to come in and take your place. We also have Congresswoman Debbie Lesko of Arizona, and Tom Mcclintock of California, Ralph Norman of South Carolina. Then we will hear pre-recorded statements from Senators Ted Cruz, Joni Ernst, Mike Lee, and Rand Paul, and finally, Representative Jim Banks. Any questions that anyone may have, we will respond after everybody has spoken and after the recordings. Now I'd like to ask Senator Marcia Blackburn to speak, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much. I am thrilled to join you all today. And we are in Tennessee and we are out working. But first of all, to Citizens Against Government Waste, thank you ever so much for your consistency and bringing these issues forward. You just mentioned the 2011 Earmark Ban, and that is something that was so vitally important to us in the House. And if it had been held to, we would not now be at $26 trillion in debt. And this keeps mounting every year. One of the ways to keep a handle on it is to eliminate earmarks and to get rid of these things that have no federal nexus. And that is something we should continue to hold steadfast to. And again, I want to say thank you so much to Citizens Against Government Waste for continuing, pardon me, to keep the pressure on about holding spending accountable, finding ways to rein in not only the legislative branch, but the bureaucratic branch when it comes to spending government money, putting programs in place that we do not need, that will have outlived their usefulness by the time our children and grandchildren are earning paychecks and have to pay for these programs. So thank you for the continued good work.
Okay, first glitch, I have to unmute myself. Thank you very much, Senator Blackburn. We will now go to Congressman Ted Budd.
Hey, thanks, Tom, and good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to be back with you all virtually this time, and perhaps we'll be back together in person again next year, Tom. I want to thank Citizens Against Government Waste for their tireless work on behalf of all taxpayers. Our resources and your resources are invaluable to everyone in Washington and to each and every American citizen as well. As a small business person myself, I really appreciate you rooting out waste and making sure that our government operates more efficiently and more responsibly. I also want to commend you on your scheduling on tax day, and that really couldn't be more ironic. Tax day is the day that a lot of taxpayers dread the most, and the Pig Book is the book that the Washington swamp really dreads the most. So this year's Pig Book will certainly get taxpayers upset, and that's for very good reason. This 2020 edition has exposed 274 earmarks that cost nearly $16 billion. And those top line numbers are really bad. And Tom, you mentioned a few of these earlier in your introduction, but there's millions of dollars in there for fish screens. And as a North Carolinian in the 13th district, I have no idea what a fish screen is, but there's hundreds of thousands of dollars for brown tree snake eradication. You mentioned that one earlier, And we really don't know what that is here in North Carolina's 13th district. But the worst part of this is, outside of the tremendous waste in money, is a so-called moratorium on pork barrel spending, which it really is, it's not in effect, but it really should be in effect. But that's why, along with my colleague, and I'm glad to see him on the Zoom call here with Ralph Norman, is the Earmark Elimination Act. So thank you, Ralph. Good work there. It's always great to do the Lord's work with you, especially when it comes to government waste. But the only way to really end this pork barrel spending in Washington is to pass a law permanently banning earmarks once and for all. So I'm going to keep fighting, along with my colleagues that you have on this call, to make sure that that happens. You know, each and every taxpayer dollar is sacred, and we should start treating it that way. So thanks again for all that you do. Thanks to you, Tom, and thanks to Citizens Against Government Waste.
Thank you, Congressman Budd. We will now hear from Congressman Tim Burchett of Tennessee.
Thank you, Tom. It's a pleasure being here. I remember last year it was a little colder, and I got to meet Ted Budd. So it was, you know, up and down. It evened out pretty good. So it turned out we've been buddies ever since. So you're muted. I hate doing that, saying that to you. Oh, you need a 13-year-old. Ted's, but what'd you say, Ted?
Oh, I can unmute. I can comment from the peanut gallery here.
Okay, cool. And Tom, you need a 13-year-old daughter to show you what you're doing wrong and embarrass you with your computer skills. That's all I got to say about that. Hey, but thank y'all so much, and thank y'all for inviting me to the event again this year as a freshman. I'm honored to be here in my second year. It's a great honor to join y'all. Citizens Against Government Waste has done great work exposing the excessive spending in this year's pig book. Somebody asked me if I like pork the other day, and I said the closest thing I come to pork is there's a place called Pop's Donuts that's locally owned near my house, and they have this maple donut that they sprinkle bacon on. That's about the closest I get to it. So I appreciate y'all. And y'all know the federal deficit is exploding. Tom, you said earlier, a lot more eloquent than I did. I think it was at $864 billion. It's unacceptable. We got to get spending under control, and it starts, of course, with Congress. The House will vote on their appropriations bill. I think they're voting on it this morning or soon. I would hope that they would bring more transparency and accountability to this round of spending. When you said that about the salmon last year, or I think it was salmon, I walked out after voting against that bill. I said that if they wanted to study salmon, they could have gone to the Red Lobster and done it for $12.95. And of course, that infuriated a lot of people, but people understood. I think they understand what's going on. The economy, of course, is slow due to the coronavirus, and it is. I don't think it's appropriate for us to keep spending out of control. The next COVID relief package, it's got to be fiscally responsible if there's got to be anything at all, especially the areas of unemployment and stimulus checks. I think we all agree that we've just got to get America back to work. Just paying people not to work is killing our economy, and if I think it's a little bit by design, in my opinion, which is not worth a whole lot. And I'm disgusted with what's going on, but I want to thank you, Tom, for the great work y'all done in the Pig Book. And it's always good to see my buddy Ralph Norman, Debbie Lesko, Bill Flores, and I think there's some more out there. Marcia Blackburn, I served with her in the state Senate. Mr. Mcclintock, probably the coolest name in Washington right now, as far as I'm concerned, outside of Burchett. But anyway, Tom, thank you again, brother. And I'll turn it, and I'll yield the remainder of my time back to the next person, as you all like to, you bureaucrats like to say up here in DC. Good seeing y'all.
Thank you very much, Congressman. Really appreciate your remarks. And like everyone else here, I hope to see you all in person next year with our live pigs. Now we have Congressman Bill Flores. Again, want to mention that he has been the most consistent attending our events for many, many years. And maybe you can come back and show up after retirement.
Well, Tom, that would be great. And howdy, everybody, and good morning. I appreciate everybody participating on this annual event that always tends to be a wake-up call for America's taxpayer. It's a pleasure to be here with Citizens Against Government Waste to help unveil the 2020 Pig Book, their 28th edition of Uncovering Federal Pork Spending in Washington. CAGW is to be commended for their continuous work highlighting the most ridiculous, the most absurd, and the most wasteful examples of government access. The Pig Book has become the conscience of taxpayers, and it serves an important function, and that's to detail just where taxpayer money is going and when it is going somewhere it should not be going. This year's Pig Book identifies 274 tacked on programs, which cost taxpayers just under $16 billion. And as you heard earlier, this is a 133% increase from fiscal year 2017, which shows that the continued growth of spending over the last few years has not really been reined in. Prior to my election to Congress in 2010, Congress had a big problem with pork barrel spending on both sides of the aisle. Taxpayers were angered to learn their hard-earned taxpayer dollars being squandered on projects like the infamous bridge to nowhere in Alaska and the Rainforest Museum in Iowa. The Republican Study Committee, which I was proud to chair during the 114th Congress, then consistently argued against the practice of earmarking and continues to argue against the practice of earmarking. And I'm hopeful that we will continue to ultimately be successful in this regard. Unfortunately, there are recent rumblings to reinstate earmarks, but to do so would be against what Americans want to see in Washington. Americans have made it clear that they want to drain the swamp, and President Trump and previous Republican Congresses work to do just that. We can't start to fill it back up now. You know, we all know where funding comes from. Article 1, Section 9 of the Constitution clearly states no money shall be drawn from the Treasury, but in consequence of an appropriations made by law. We must restore Congress's constitutional authority of the power of the purse by having Congress in control of the appropriations process, not bureaucrats, and not through the use of earmarks. We should not leave it in the hands of any administration's bureaucrats. It's time that we stopped unelected, unaccountable, out of control bureaucrats from making decisions that should be done by Congress. But Congress should only fund those activities and projects that are specifically set forth in the enumerated powers of the federal government. So I want to conclude by this, by thanks again to CAGW for promoting fiscal responsibility. Tom and his team do a great job, and I look forward to hearing from Debbie Lesko now.
Thank you, Congressman Flores. And now, for the first time at one of our events, we have Representative Debbie Lesko of Arizona.
Well, thank you so much, Tom. And I want to thank the Citizens Against Government Waste for everything that you do and have done for years now. I hail from the great state of Arizona, where we have quite the history of conservative leaders that have fought against overspending and government waste. So I'm very proud to be from that state and from the people that have fought for years against it. You know, I started out fighting against government waste and high taxes and those type of things years ago. I was just a mom and got involved. And I remember putting out homemade street signs years ago, and it competed with these big signs that were paid for by special interest that benefited from the tax increases in my local community. And I remember when it rained, it doesn't rain too much in Arizona, but when it rained, my homemade signs got all wet. And so I learned kind of many years ago that it's very difficult for a taxpayer and individual citizens to fight against special interests that directly benefit from more government spending. And so that's why your organization, Tom, is so very vital, because you're there helping us, pointing out ways that the government wastes money and that we're spending too much money, and holding elected officials accountable. And after I was this community type person that was railing against high taxes and wasteful spending, then I got the opportunity to serve in the Arizona legislature, 6 years in the House and 3 years in the Senate. And I remember going to one of the Citizens Against Government Waste conference that you had for state legislators, and it was very beneficial. So I just want to applaud your organization for the hard work that you're doing, and for you, Tom, for the hard work you're doing. It's very vital. And I also am appreciative of the, what is it, the Taxpayer Superhero Award. That's like a fantastic name. And so thank you again, and God bless everyone that's on this call.
Thank you very much. Really appreciate your remarks and your service and coming from where you did and showing people how it should be done. If you really are concerned, get involved. It's pretty simple. Next, we have Congressman Tom Mcclintock, who has been with us for many, many years at these press events. It's been a taxpayer superhero on our votes several times, and we appreciate your work, Congressman. So you're next.
Tom, thank you. I appreciate your work. And first of all, I want to thank you and CAGW and everyone who supports CAGW for continuing to beat the drums against government waste at this particularly critical time in the history of our country. After 8 years of serving on the Budget Committee, I finally left because it became clear that neither party had much interest in controlling wasteful federal spending. At least I can say the Republicans would give it lip service from time to time, while the Democrats' only complaint was that we weren't spending money fast enough. But I'm afraid that those days will look quaint when the waste in this year's spending is finally tallied. And I'm afraid that to do it justice, we'll need to issue not just a pig book next year. I think you need to start considering issuing a pig farm library. We need to understand that every $1 trillion of federal spending we throw around in Washington, that actually means $8,000 paid by an average household in this country, either in direct taxes or in tax-driven price increases as businesses pass their costs to consumers. And since we're now spending far beyond our means, that's money that's borrowed from those same families that they will then have to pay through their future taxes. CAGW's greatest crusade is to stop this practice of earmarks. And I want to address for just a moment those who say that earmarks are just a harmless exercise of Congress's power to appropriate. Well, the fundamental principle of our Constitution, it dates back to Magna Carta, is the division of powers. One branch makes law but cannot enforce it. The other enforces law but cannot make it. One branch declares war but cannot wage it. The other branch wages war but cannot fight it or declare it. And one branch appropriates money but cannot spend it. The other spends money but cannot appropriate it. Earmarks strike at the very heart of that principle by combining the power to appropriate with the power to spend. And it shouldn't surprise us that that's a formula that has consistently produced both waste and corruption. We need to, as we begin to consider the next round of spending related to these ill-advised lockdowns, I think it's time we confronted a simple truth. Government does not finance the economy. The economy finances the government. And when we shut down the economy, we shut down the revenues that government spends. At such a time as this, we ought to be extra careful how that money is being spent. And if we don't heed and practice that truth very soon, history's harsh lesson will be visited on our country, and it's this: nations that bankrupt themselves aren't around very long, because before you can provide for the common defense or promote the general welfare, you have to be able to pay for them. And the ability of our country to do that is about to be severely tested. So thank you, Tom. Thank you, CAGW, for sounding the alarm. CAGW has provided the answers, and now we're left with a simple, haunting question. Will the American people finally demand their government stop mortgaging their future and squandering their earnings? Thanks again.
Thank you very much, Congressman. Always appreciate your remarks. And last and certainly not least, another taxpayer superhero and the co-sponsor, actually author of the Earmark Elimination Act, Congressman Ralph Norman of South Carolina. Congressman, I think you're still muted.
Okay, how about now?
You're good.
Okay, thank you, Tom. Appreciate what you do. I appreciate all my other congressional members being on here. You know, with the Pig Book, what you're doing is shedding light on something that's really hard to find. And that's what I like so much about it. We put out monthly piglets, which is spending that hopefully catches on with the American people, particularly in the 5th District. But, you know, as and I'm a real estate developer. When people ask me to build a building, it comes down to, are you going to do it or are you not going to do it? I think we're at that point right now. As Tom Mcclintock said, it's, and I've been on the budget committee, and try to get any cuts is impossible from both sides. Now, I think that we're at a point of no return where we're going to have to do something. And I guess the answer is, one, electing people that are willing to do what members on this conference are willing to do, which is to vote to rein in spending. That's the bottom line. And secondly, we've got to publicize where the tax dollars are going. As Ted said, tax dollars are sacred money, and how we're going to pay this back. And when you talk about $860 billion for 1 month, it's something that we're going to have to get a control on. Somebody is going to have. We're going to have to handle it. But I just appreciate what you're doing. It's I think we're at a critical point. As one man told me, he said, "Why are y'all dropping money out of helicopters and just hoping it lands in the right place?" It's time to say no, and it's time to stand up. And we're certainly, I know a group of us are willing to do that. Appreciate what you're doing, and look forward to working with you in the future.
Thank you very much, Congressman, and thank you again to everyone who has been with us this morning. As I said, feel free to stay on. You'll be able to see our videos. I want to thank Sean Kennedy, our research director, who has once again waded through mountains of pork to write the Congressional Pig Book, which, by the way, I have to say I wrote the first one in 1991. So we have been doing this for a long time. And I'm not as old as I look, I don't think. I also want to thank Alex Abrams, our communications director, for doing this basically on her own. First time we've put together something like this. It seemed to be a lot easier when we could get the pigs in the room and bring everybody together. And we really look forward to doing that next year. So thank you all again. Our videos will now begin, starting with Senator Ted Cruz, followed by Joni Ernst, Mike Lee, and Rand Paul, and then Representative Jim Banks.
It's a real privilege to once again join my good friends at the Citizens Against Government Waste for the annual Congressional Pig Book Conference. Though the gigantic, bright pink pigs are absent from this year's press conference, one doesn't have to look very far to see gigantic, bright pink pigs on Capitol Hill. Namely the pork, the out-of-control spending, and the astronomical debts. For far too long, members of both parties have been content with bankrupting future generations of Americans. They've been content with wasting hard-working taxpayers' money. They've been content with a soaring deficit. Through the annual Pink Book, Citizens Against Government Waste stands up against that. The Pink Book is often considered the most hated book in Washington. And I gotta say, for those of us who fight each and every day against wasteful spending, this book is a tremendous tool and a real resource. This book shines a powerful light on the worst pork spending that occurs over and over and over again in the federal budget. The men and women of Citizens Against Government Waste are steadfast allies in our fight to restore fiscal sanity. And I'm proud to stand and fight alongside y'all each and every day. Thank you, and God bless you.
Citizens Against Government Waste may not be the most popular group in Washington for obvious reasons, but taxpayers across the country have no better friend or ally protecting their pocketbooks from the big spenders here in Congress. Their efforts, and most notably the annual Congressional Pig Book, helped put an end to earmarking altogether. After generating years of embarrassing headlines and investigations, Congress enacted a moratorium on the practice in 2011, or so we were told. Despite the ban, Citizens Against Government Waste's latest Congressional Pig Book reveals 274 earmarks costing $15.9 billion in this year's spending bills. This includes millions of dollars for politicians' pet projects, such as wild horse and burro management and the Kennedy Center. Congress may hope to hide these pork projects in the bloated federal budget that now adds up to $4.7 trillion a year, but Citizens Against Government Waste keeping them honest. Folks, I can tell you from firsthand experience, it is a never-ending challenge to round up all the pork in Washington when nearly every elected official is doing everything they can to bring home the bacon. That is why I'm proud to stand with Citizens Against Government Waste, who has been making them squeal since 1984.
Thank you all for inviting me to introduce the 2020 Congressional Pig Book today. It's an honor to fight against waste in our federal government, but I think we all wish it weren't necessary. At one point, we thought we had won the war against earmarks. Republicans did, in fact, ban them in 2010. Unfortunately, the swamp being what it is, earmarks are back and getting bigger every year. This year, Citizens Against Government Waste found $15.9 billion worth of earmarks in fiscal year 2020, an increase of 3.9% from fiscal year 2019. Going back to fiscal year 2017, earmarks have increased by 133.8% since Congress loosened its ban on the practice. When the ban on earmarks was loosened in 2018, we were told it was necessary to make Congress functional again. See, they said, Congress can't get anything done anymore. Earmarks may not be great, but they're the industrial lubricant of the sausage-making factory that is Congress, and bringing them back will get the machine working properly again. Like many terrible political arguments, it's superficially appealing. Congress is indeed dysfunctional, but bringing earmarks back hasn't improved anything. We still lurch from cliff to cliff and crisis to crisis without any meaningful debate or amendment process. The fight over earmarks is really a fight over two competing visions of how Congress should govern. The Washington establishment likes the current system, where party leaders negotiate and write bills behind closed doors, often orchestrating a legislative cliff, so that members are left with a binary choice between two terrible options. This system keeps the campaign and lobbying cash flowing through leadership offices and their alums on K Street. The tough decisions are made in secret without any accountability. But no one likes the current arrangement of government by cliff, so the swamp hopes all that's needed is a little earmark lubricant to keep the game going. But the fact is that this corrupt system excludes all but a handful of representatives and senators, and so effectively disenfranchises hundreds of millions of Americans. Bringing back earmarks will only make that situation worse. The alternative system would be one of transparency, decentralization, and accountability. Representatives and senators would write legislation collaboratively, in open, forging popular compromises and taking tough votes. Anytime someone says, what we really need to do is get everyone in a room to hammer out the details. Remember, the Constitution provides for two such rooms, the House and Senate chambers. The reason Congress doesn't work today is that both party establishments are afraid of the electoral consequences of the public actually seeing a freewheeling debate that they can't control. Eventually, Congress will reform itself and so restore itself to its proper role in the federal government and in American life. Earmarks are just one more bad idea that we need to discard before we finally face the truth and do our jobs.
Good morning. Well, unfortunately, I can't be with you in person. I wanted to take just a moment to thank Citizens Against Government Waste for their work to stop government from wasting your money. I'm pleased to report that CAGW's 2020 version of their Congressional Pig Book is just as strong as in years past. It's no secret that Congress has a spending problem, and it's a totally bipartisan one. Democrats and Republicans in Congress have struck an unholy bargain to keep the spending going. even in the face of our crushing debt and deficit. The Congressional Budget Office projects that the federal deficit for this year alone will be $3.7 trillion, and that our national debt has now exploded greater than $26 trillion. Well, there are still a few of us in Congress who care about wasteful spending and work hard to expose and stop it. Congress is largely asleep at the wheel and rolling on with business as usual. And despite a self-imposed ban on earmarks, Congress still has found ways to continue the pork barrel spending and sneak through earmarked funding. This is one reason why CAGW's work is vital. This year's CAGW Congressional Pig Book, Illustrating Waste, reveals over $15 billion in earmarks. As Congress continues to spend more and more all the time, the work of watchdog groups like CAGW only increases in importance. I look forward to their continued efforts to bring wasteful government spending and practices to light.
Hey, Congressman Jim Banks from Indiana here. We all know that House Democrats, led by Chairwoman Nita Lowey, are trying to bring back earmarks, and there's almost near unanimous support in the House Democrat Conference to do it. Unfortunately, there are a lot of Republicans who support bringing back earmarks as well. That's why we are so indebted to the work of Citizens Against Government Waste and putting out the annual Pig Book. And this year's 2020 Pig Book is a doozy, exposing almost $16 billion of pork barrel spending and earmarks in the current federal spending over the last year. It's important that we all take a look at this book, read it, and do something about it. I'm going to do my part as a House conservative to expose wasteful pork barrel spending, and you can do your part as well. Thank you to Citizens Against Government Waste for your important work and letting me play a small part of the work that you do. Thank you. God bless.